Good morning and good afternoon to you, wherever you may be as you tune in today. And thank you for joining us. For those who have joined us for the first time, this webinar series is focused on HR and workplace topics with a lens of culture, DEI, and sustainability. I'm Sonia Sapaban, CEO of OurOffice, where we help organizations with a proven, effective, and affordable solution for planning, managing, measuring, and engaging everyone to drive a more inclusive workplace experience for all individuals to belong and be productive. Today, I'm super excited to be joined by Emily Aries, founder and CEO of Bossed Up, and Tiona Nicholas, Senior People Operations Specialist at Drata. Welcome to you both, ladies. Before we get into the meat of this conversation, let's make sure you're familiar with some logistics. So I'm going to share a screen here for a moment, and then we will go. This is our smiley faces. And now this is what y'all are very familiar with. So we use the Zoom webinar tool, which is what you're in right now. This is an interactive webinar. So please use the chat function to provide your comments and any questions that you may have. We have one of my colleagues at our office, Dr. Tiffany Ingram, who will be moderating the questions in real time and chiming in as needed. Thanks in advance, Tiffany. We really appreciate it. We will answer as many questions as we can at the end as well, and afterwards if needed. So as long as you provide your email address when you ask your question, we can get back with you. Also, please note this session is being recorded, and it will all be available after the webinar on our events page at ouroffice.io/events. Last but not least, this webinar is approved for both SHRM and HRCI recertification credits. We will share the activity codes later on during the webinar. So Emily and Tiona, it's great to have you both here. To begin, I'm sure our audience would love to get to know you better. Can you each please spend just a minute or two introducing yourself and your current role, as well as your background and personal experiences that have brought you here and to this moment of your life and your career. Would you like to start, Tiona?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, y'all. I'm Tiona Nicholas. I currently live in Dallas, Texas. I have a bachelor's degree in criminology, a master's degree in criminal justice, but my background is really in the startup space, helping create thriving people environments. I'm currently a senior people operations specialist at an organization called Drata, where we automate the compliance journey for other organizations. I'm also an advisor for an organization called Change Engine, and I am also going to be starting my doctorate in the fall at USC in organizational change and leadership, which is just a really fancy way of saying I'm going to be studying people in the workplace. What has brought me to this point is really the influences that I've surrounded myself with over the years. I was lucky enough to work for a SaaS organization that had heavy women leadership, including a woman CEO. That was incredibly impactful. They really became my mentors and helped me find my voice, my confidence, and it really just made me who I am personally and professionally today.
Wow, thank you so much. You do so many exciting and interesting things, Tiona. Thank you for sharing that. And Emily, would you like to go next?
Sure. Delighted to be here. So for me, about 15 years ago, I was working in the pretty male-dominated field of campaigns and elections. I started off graduating with my fancy degree in political science, ready to go out and make change and save the world. And just a few years later, despite the fact that I was rising quickly in the world of politics as the youngest state director in the nation, serving on behalf of Organizing for America, I was completely and utterly burnt out before the age of 25. And as it turns out, the more I worked in the double male-dominated space of technology and politics, I realized that there were a lot of women of color, and a lot of marginalized professionals in general who were experiencing chronic stress and burnout at alarming rates. And I knew that if I wanted to be in this for the long haul, if I wanted a career with long-term impact, in a world that had socialized me as a young woman to put everyone else's needs before my own, both personally and professionally, then the way I was working wasn't going to be working. And so that was the beginning of a deep professional and personal journey into creating my personal and professional development company called Bossed Up. Bossed Up's a community that serves women around the world and organizations who want to retain and develop women, especially in male-dominated fields, by providing the tools and community that we need to be our own best advocates in creating radical progress in our careers. So over the past decade, I've created this organization, become an author, a podcaster, and have in so many ways made sure that I'm not burning out on the road to fighting burnout for all women everywhere. So really excited to be here. I think about and talk about women in the workplace all day, every day. So this is a great month to highlight this conversation.
Wow, I'm in awe of both of you ladies. So thanks for making time for this. I know it's a busy month and you both are very much in demand. So we really cherish this time. And for everyone who will be watching the recording later on. Now, because we are, this is Women's History Month. It's, the very end here, the day before last. But I think it's a good time to start by sharing a bit of the history of this special recognition month, just in case so everybody's on the same page. The National Women's Day was first celebrated in New York City by the Socialist Party of America. Let's not hold that against them. And it was started in 1909. Today, the US celebrates a whole month designated as Women's History Month. But the recognition of women that started here, you might be surprised to find out, it's really spread worldwide. In fact, the International Women's Day, which is typically celebrated on March 8th, is an official holiday in about 30 countries around the world. And I was surprised by the list of some of these countries. I rattled off a few just because I think it's really interesting. Even in countries that are not known for really, women's rights, and in fact, just quite the opposite, like Afghanistan, in Cambodia, in China, but for women only, it's a holiday. Cuba, Nepal, Russia, Uganda, Ukraine, Vietnam, and Zambia. These are just a few. And while there are, cultural differences, I was looking into that, and all these celebrations seem to involve, men honoring their mothers, their wives, their girlfriends, female colleagues and friends. They bring them flowers, small gifts to show their appreciation for women and their accomplishments. So I think we should start, maybe you're good at campaigns, Emily, maybe we should start a campaign for a holiday here. But, and this is a big but, we know that after over 100 years that this was started, right? We just talked about 1909. Women's rights today appear to be under attack around the world as they struggle for some basic freedoms. For example, in our country here in the US, we all know that women's reproductive rights have just been severely restricted by the US Supreme Court. Their decision last year, and in many states, with some legislation that has been enacted or is in the process of being enacted. And then you have, all across, the other end of the side of the world in a country like Iran, where women are suffering and even being killed for how they dress, which has sparked this, woman life freedom movement. And some say even the beginnings of a revolution that's threatening the government in that country and has gotten a lot of attention globally. So given just a little bit of this background here, I want to ask each one of you to please speak to how you see the current state of women's rights and gender equity and its global and local impacts. Just at a pretty high, let's start high and then we'll delve deep as we always do. Would you like to go first, Emily?
Sure. Yeah. I just, I think it's probably best that I go first because I don't have the most optimistic viewpoint right now. Because, as wonderful as it is to have an International Women's Day and a Women's History Month, women make up more than 50% of the world, and we don't want a day. We don't want a month. We simply want our human rights to be respected. And yet that seems to be too much to ask in many countries across the globe, including the very exceptional United States. I'm gravely concerned about how we are moving backwards, not only as a country when it comes to public policies relating to women's bodily autonomy, like you said, or any number of rights related to equal pay, paid family and medical leave, which every other developed nation has already offered to women in the workplace. We are exceptionally behind on that front. But I'm also concerned by what I'm seeing in the private sector this year. Tech in particular has historically led the way on the future of work. And what are we seeing happen in tech right now? Layoffs are disproportionately impacting the already few women that were in tech, and particularly the diversity, equity, and inclusion officers that many companies just got around to hiring 2 years ago. So yeah, I'm concerned. I'm concerned when we're glamorizing the kind of machismo on display with Elon Musk taking over Twitter and immediately doing away with every employee resource group. I think we have a choice in this coming year. I'm not trying to get, political here, but we do have a choice before us as a nation in the face as women and all people who care about rights and human rights and women's rights. Are we going to be okay with this? Are we going to be compliant and quiet and sit back and watch the progress that so many have clawed for, just be rolled back? And so I am deeply concerned about the trend away from diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm sure everyone tuning in here today isn't experiencing that, or hopefully doesn't see that as happening in their companies, but it's happening. And it's happening at more companies than I would care to count right now. So I'm hopeful that we can make some noise about it and remind the world as to why this should have always been a priority, but only very recently became one.
Yeah, thank you for that, Emily. You really triggered something that I think we need to be transparent about in terms of the intent of our webinar series. Our intent is to help us all better understand the factors, strategies, and actions that influence workplace culture so that we can all grow as leaders and feel that we belong as employees. So I want to be sure everyone is aware that our conversation will be uncomfortable at times. It's by design because one, it's not our intent to offend anyone at all, certainly. We feel it's necessary to have uncomfortable conversations to better understand the problems we're dealing with and to come up with effective and sustainable solutions. So that's just, a fair notice up front. So I appreciate you sharing how you feel about that. Again, I think that not only we will make some noise, as you said, I think my own perspective is, very much in alignment with what you said about some of the areas where, especially with the pandemic and with the layoffs and so on, some of the ground that we may have gained very, with really a lot of hard work is getting rolled back, and it's just in the data. You can just see it. So we're here to see what we can do. And women, certainly their voice, women just will not be silenced anymore. I mean, everywhere in the world, under the worst conditions. Again, this I have to emphasize. I mean, certainly I will share. I'm first generation American born. I'm very proud to be an Iranian American with my heritage that goes back to Iran and Russia. Don't hold that against me, but I feel a connection. I've always felt like I have one foot on in the West and one in the East. And I must say that this, it's just so inspiring to see the women, Zan Zendegi Azadi is the woman life freedom, and mantra that they picked up and how they're leading that. And in a moment, we'll talk about their allies and how important allyship is. So let us continue and talk about this in real terms and what the real problems are, and not shy away. And we appreciate all the comments and anyone who wants to chime in as well. But please, again, we don't mean to offend anyone. But it is important to have these conversations. So Tiona, how about you? What's your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Emily. We are moving backwards in a lot of ways, and the overturn of Roe v. Wade is a prime example of that. But I do have a little bit more of a positive, if you will, outlook on things, just a little. And, I think of the women in Iran, right? And I can't help but be inspired by how they're risking their little freedom or no freedom at all, depending on how you look at it. And they're risking their life to go out and protest for what they think is right, which is the rights of women. I go out and protest here in Dallas, Texas, and sure, there's a possibility that something could happen to me, right? But I feel pretty safe. These women are going out and they're risking being imprisoned up to 20 plus years. They're being beaten. They're being sexually assaulted. They're being killed. That is strength. That is courage. That is a bravery. These are the influences that I look at to use my voice, to go do the things that I need to do to make a change.
Yeah, so to summarize, you agree that the state of affairs is grave, not to over dramatize here, but it can also be a source of motivation and inspiration, which I also totally agree with. Am I stating it correctly?
Yes, absolutely.
I love that, because the first stage of movement building is agitation, right? You can't make change until we get agitated. So it's a really important first place to start.
Yeah, and it always really does get, they do say it's darkest just before dawn, right? So, so with that context, we really want to focus on actions. What can each one of us do? What action can we take now in our own locus of control? In fact, I'll say, if we're not motivated to actually do something after this conversation, then we haven't communicated effectively to help solve the issues. And so, then we're part of the problem. So let's talk about the solutions. Let's talk about allyship specifically. Last year for this month, we had a mixed panel with some gentlemen on the panel. And so certainly really believe that it's a really big part of it. But let's talk first about what it really means to be an ally. Are you really an ally if you simply believe in gender equity? Please go ahead, whoever wants to start.
Yeah, I'll hop right in. I love the question because I think of allyship as a continuum. Jennifer Brown puts it best when she writes in her book, How to Be an Inclusive Leader, that every one of us is on a continuous spectrum of growth when it comes to being an active ally. And I think that's the key word there, is active, because optical allyship, saying I'm an ally, saying I believe this is important, it doesn't actually really change the reality for anybody. So in some ways that can actually be harmful in that it centers you, the ally, in the conversation, when in fact we should be centering whatever marginalized community we're advocating on behalf of. And the fact of the matter is, none of us, even those of us who are experts in inclusive leadership and active allyship, I've created a course on how men can be great allies to women in the workplace for LinkedIn Learning, but that doesn't mean that I'm always a perfect ally in every context. We're continuously becoming more aware of the hidden microaggressions, the systemic oppressions that exist in our society and in our workplaces and worlds that relate to different people with different life circumstances. So, we can't relate and empathize overnight to every person's experience, which means we're continuously learning and always on a growth continuum, from going from aware of how I can be a better ally to engaged, to actively making my voice heard or risking something, truly expending my own social capital, political capital, financial capital, power on behalf of others. And so acknowledging that none of us are a finished product when it comes to being an ally is an important way to keep it active and not so optical.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Tiana, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, when I think of allyship, I think of allyship being about progress, not perfection. And I think we forget that sometimes because we want so much change to happen overnight, and that's just not realistic. Allyship is a lifelong process. It requires frequent and consistent behaviors. It's about supporting the underrepresented and marginalized individuals and groups. It's not about fixing others. It's about lifting others. And if anyone's on this call that knows me personally, I know you know what I'm about to say, but I have this life motto that I live by personally and professionally, and it's always leave people better than you found them. And when I was thinking about allyship, I couldn't help but tie that into the life motto that I live by.
That is such a great message from both of you. I love the growth mindset, right? That none of us are perfect. I mean, that's the human experience, right? That's part of the human experience. That's part of, no matter what your belief system is, I think we all have to agree that even challenges, everything is really somewhat designed to be a better version of ourselves, right? And so I think it's really important to keep that in mind. And so for those who are not, super active allies yet, as Emily called them, active allies. I want to talk a little bit about the why. We always try and talk about the why, the what, and the how. I really love Simon Sinek and the why conversation, because that's what really gets people hooked. So specifically, why should we all be active allies to women? I can share a couple of high-level facts, and then we'll see what y'all think about it, Tiona and Emily. So according to a new report from Moody Analytics, the global economy is missing out on about $7 trillion a year due to gender inequity. And at the current rate, the World Economic Forum estimates that it would take 132 years to reach full gender parity. Now, NASA says, I used to be at NASA the first decade of my career, and NASA says that they'll be on Mars before end of the decade, right? So it's, these things it's not, why is it so hard, right? So, and we are missing out a lot. There's lots of data out there. I picked this global number to share because it's truly not only an American problem, only an Iranian problem or Afghani problem. It is a problem pretty much everywhere. There's very few countries where they're even close to any level of gender parity. So it's really important to global economy and prosperity, and more we're all dependent on each other. If the pandemic didn't teach us, how connected we are, I don't know what would. So I want to ask you both, why is it so important for everyone to aspire to be an active ally?
When we look at the workplace just alone, there are so many benefits to being an ally. It improves so much. It creates safety within an organization. It improves the productivity within an organization. We have a lot more diversity, which brings a lot more train of thought throughout the organization. It just shows that you're not alone in this fight.
Totally. I'm reminded of an op-ed that Warren Buffett wrote for Fortune magazine back in 2013. And you don't think of an old white guy in finance when you think of like women's inclusion and diversity, equity, and inclusion. But Warren Buffett really described the capitalist imperative of, he called it unlocking the full potential of our entire workforce. Because that's really what's happening. We're losing out on the psychological capital, the human potential of 100% of our workforce and of our world. You don't have to look very far, because McKinsey and Company and Lean In come out with a new global workforce report about gender equity, or the lack thereof. And just this last year, they coined the term the Great Breakup to describe the mass exodus of senior women in the workforce who've already worked so hard to get to the tables they're a part of. We're losing them. Anyone in human resources, which I know we've got quite a few folks tuning in from HR, knows how expensive it is to lose top talent. And so that's a big part of it. Then you look back to the McKinsey and Company and Lean In study from a few years ago that described the broken rung problem, which shows that for every man who goes from individual contributor to first-time manager, way fewer women are getting that first step up. So only about 82 women for every 100 men are given that first promotion. You look at the ambition and it's there. These women want that promotion. In fact, Black women in America are some of the most ambitious professionals in our workforce who are not given those equal opportunities. That's just bad HR, y'all. That is not a good use of our resources. And so for the good of our creativity, of our companies, of our moral imperative of proclaiming to be caring about equality and equity and equal opportunity, the benefits are manifold in that they're both the right move strategically for your business, but they're also the right move morally for folks who care about gender equity. The last little thing I'll say on this is that the data coming out of mentor and mentee relationships is very interesting, and I think indicative of why allies can benefit too. We know that mentors benefit from mentoring just as much as mentees do, right? They have personal benefits, they feel more engaged at work, they feel more fulfilled in their careers, but they also have more matrixed relationships, which lead to more sustainability in their career paths. So the same thing is true for allies. Mentorship is just one of many ways to be an active ally. But the fact of the matter is it makes your career a little stronger as well as being a way to give back.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for sharing those stats. Since you quoted Warren Buffett, I'll have to do my own quote. The one that has stuck with me over the years is one that, the Alibaba founder, the Chinese big Alibaba company, the founder, Jack Ma, he said that he was really proud. I think at the time he had like 35% or so of his senior management were women. And he said something to the effect that they really make his company's yin and yang balanced. And that was really his secret sauce to success, was how many women, he had in his company. And again, as we've seen throughout history, in fact, one of the things, again, now from my heritage, again, my Russian side, I'll share that it may be a little known that the role of women and their struggles, was really pivotal in the Russian Revolution. It actually started with women protesting their conditions in 1917, and then their male counterparts and allies joined them. Today, we talked about Iran a little bit, and the women are getting killed and imprisoned and tortured and sexually abused for not wanting to, perhaps completely comply with the full Islamic hijab requirements that the government has imposed. But their husbands, their brothers, their fathers and sons are supporting them. And they're also in the streets. They're also getting killed. And all of this has gotten worldwide attention. In fact, at Grammys, that there's a song that they made that an Iranian songwriter, wrote and has become world renowned, and it won the first social impact award at Grammys that was handed out by the First Lady. And so, men have been, supporting them. And one of the interesting things I saw was like there was some edict that all women, especially in the pharmacies, I don't know why they singled out pharmacies, but these are real stories, right? I always feel like real stories make it interesting, right? There was an edict that all women in pharmacies had to wear the full black head covering, for example. And then there were pictures, I actually posted it on my LinkedIn, of men starting to wear also head covering, like a hijab, I mean, that's really, it looks funny, right? But it makes such a statement. And the thing that's really, to me, always is so important in this discussion of gender equity is one reason above all that we should care is that we were all born of a mother. We all had a mother, right? Regardless, anybody who's listening to this podcast now or will ever listen to it in the future. Right? And most of us, many of us have sisters, daughters, wives. And so it is important because it's really globally half the population. And how could we miss out on that? So hopefully we've convinced everyone that it is everyone's job to help, this cause within, again, your locus of control and what you can do. So let's dig a little bit deeper and spend the second part of our conversation about, what and the how, right? Can you share some real life stories of how true allyship and real change, have you seen it really at play, whether it's in, frankly, society, communities, or in the workplace? We focus on the workplace, but in this case particularly, and in a lot of cases, the society and the community is also reflected in how things end up, shaping in the workplace. So it's as important to also, talk about the context of how the social norms have evolved, or, how communities behave. So you want to share a little bit about some real life stories of where you've seen allyship at work, where people can, get an idea. I mean, there may be people out there saying, how can I be an ally? I'm not a manager, I'm not a leader, or I'm a leader, but I'm really busy. and I put out some good statements, and my website says that we are, and our policies are, but what do you do on a day-to-day basis? I think that's when society changes, that when workplace changes, that's when communities change, is when people are exhibiting behaviors that are equitable and inclusive every day. Again, start, whoever wants to start. I'll let you go. And
I would actually like to speak to more of, it's not a work allyship, but I still think it's a really important one. And Sonia, you had touched on it when you had said that uncles and brothers and fathers were, defending their women family members. And when I think of allyship, one of the strongest allies that I can think of is parents. And if you think about it, there are parents out there that, want their children to become lawyers and doctors. And if they're not, they're a disgrace. Or you have the children that come out from the LGBTQ plus community and they get disowned. And I think of my own dad, and he's a girl dad. And I think that if he had had a son, I think his whole outlook would have been different. Not that he would have been disrespectful or anything like that towards women, but I think that the fact that he had a daughter really forced him to see things from a woman's perspective. And he had to learn how to support me, and I'm emotional, and he's like a manly man. And so just learning to have that patience. And I think about the first time I ever protested was when Roe v. Wade got overturned. And I texted my dad and I said, I'm going to go protesting. And he said, I will bail you out of jail if you need me. He said, go get pepper spray just in case. He said, I love you and I'm proud of you.
Aw.
I would not be me without him. And I also think that he would never be like, you shouldn't go do that, because he knows I'm stubborn and he knows I'm hard-headed and I'm going to go do whatever it is that I set my mind to. But I think that I think people forget how important parents are as an ally.
Yeah.
Tiana, I love that story. Can you promise me something?
Yeah.
When you see your dad next, give him a big hug from me.
I will.
And just say, there's this woman and she loves you without having seen you. I mean, that's really what it takes, right? That's what it means, I think, on a day-to-day. Emily, you want to share?
Yeah, I love that. One sort of comment that sparked for me while you were speaking, as a new mom myself of a little boy, is I think the next frontier for gender equality really rests in men and masculinity, right? Like, it's Women's History Month. I know we're talking about women's equal rights here, but I'm thinking about men's rights to be emotional too. And so I think the way that we push back on gender bias is by freeing everyone from the gender binaries that we've all been indoctrinated with. Who is it? Wade Davis, I want to say, a former NFL player who's gay. He now most identifies of all of his identities. He's a Black, gay, former football player. He says he's a feminist first, because all of those other forms of stereotyping and bias really come from the demonization and the disrespect for women, right? To be gay is only bad because you're feminine, right? Instead of adhering to some male archetypes. So I think the unfinished business of feminism extends to how we're raising the next generation of boys and men as emotionally in touch and free from the mask of masculinity too. So I love that. As a new mom and having a son, I couldn't help but see the connection there. So
I love that. I love that. You both are very well read, I know, and have thought about these issues deeply. What do you think that comes from? That idea that, femininity is maybe, weaker, or Jack Ma talks about the yin and the yang, right? If you go back to old cultures, this idea of the balance of you need both the female and the male. And the fact is we all have a female and a male side.
And also beyond the female male binary, right? Like we've always had throughout history folks who fall somewhere in between.
100%.
Can you imagine a yin and yang with only 35% yin though? Like that's the part of that story that just boggles my mind, is that 50% is equity. And so we still have a ways to go. But I think the Puritans who landed on Plymouth Rock when it comes to our history in America and the Victorian era did a number on gender stereotypes. I'm proud to be living in Denver, Colorado, that still today has a pioneering spirit, being one of the very first states in the nation to give women the right to vote here. Because if you were a pioneer woman out here, by default, Victorian era stereotypes went out the window. There wasn't the male sphere and the female sphere. Like everyone was hauling water and starting fires and trying to avoid typhoid or whatever. You know what I mean? Like this is the environment we grow up in shapes gender roles. Gender is such a social construct. And so, whether we're talking about American history or world history, it's just a really helpful reminder that we've all made this stuff up. These expectations around what makes for a good woman, these are roles handed down from generation to generation. And it's our job to take out the red pen and edit those roles as we see fit and question those roles. Like, what does it actually mean to be a good woman, a good daughter, a good mother, a good partner?
I'm going to ask a hard question, maybe. I don't think you ladies don't find anything. You're very good. What do you say to people that are, that there's this fatigue, especially about gender equity, right? There's this fatigue, and there's also fatigue around race and ethnicity. I think some people just say, I don't have any bias. I try in my daily life to be as equitable as I can. Enough already. Why do I have to listen to all of this? You even said, why do we need a Women's Month? I bet you there's a lot of people out there saying, for a different reason, also saying, why do we have to make such a big deal of it all the time? I'm good to the women in my life. What do you say to that?
I think some organizations have really started trying to incorporate DEI into their workplace to check a box. And I think that's why people are getting tired of hearing about it, because it's the same old thing over and over and over again. And they're not doing a deeper dive into why it's actually necessary. Again, these employers are just trying to check a box. They're going on LinkedIn, saying one thing, and they may not even be doing it internally. And so their employees are exhausted. They're like, nothing's happening. Like, why are we doing this? So I think when you do a deeper dive, you have the root of the problem. You are truly explaining why this is important and doing the real work. That's when you start to see an impact. But when you're just checking boxes, you get burnt out.
Yeah.
don't understand the why.
I have to say something about this because I actually was this happens often, but it just happens to have happened today also as I was talking to a great organization that wants to get some effort, more formal effort started. And typically it's like, let's start some training, let's start a committee. And then, we talk about, and our approach at our office, at our company is, we always talk about doing an assessment first, do an assessment. And the assessment is very comprehensive. It's about just how ready your infrastructure is, even your policies, your benefits, and everything else. Also looking at, how your people really feel by having some listening sessions, by having some, an employee experience survey. So there's a lot of different elements that go into it. And then developing a plan. And the plan, really the key thing about the plan is to connect, whatever your key objectives or actions are that we've identified to the organization's strategy and their priorities. And it's really about that connection, the why, again, going back to the why, the Simon Sinek why. And when you don't do that up front, and they were asking us, well, what if we didn't start that way? If we just formed our committee and did some training. And we said, it's true, of course you can, and it's not like a huge thing, you can do the assessment later on. But then this is so central, what you're bringing up, Tiana, is really about people then don't understand why we're doing these things. And you can get upfront this a little bit of a backlash, whether it's, visible to you and you're aware of it or not, right? So people quietly, there's a lot of quiet quitting on things, going on, and you could have some quiet quitting on the DEI effort, or this approach, this thing about culture, and people can get, there's a fatigue going on. And unless you make it really clear why this is important to why we're here, to our mission, in a workplace environment, it can really have adverse effects. And I think you're absolutely right about that. Emily, do you want to add?
Yeah, I just think also, for those experiencing fatigue, like, welcome to the party, right? Like, racial battle fatigue is real, and it's been happening for communities of color and women in male-dominated spaces for a lot longer than everyone's been paying attention to it. So, it's definitely a part of it. I work with nonprofits and organizers on organizer burnout, and how do you keep fighting for movement building work that is always inherently involves 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But if we're waiting for the arc of the universe to bend towards justice, as Dr. MLK would say, right, you're gonna have some low points along the way. What I think is troubling is that a lot of, frankly, let's talk about race here. A lot of white folks just got involved in 2020, and when it was pretty obvious that it was hard to not care and not be aware and not get involved. And now we're 3 years in and people are like, oh, we're still dealing with this. To which I say, imagine being a Black person in America, right? Like, they get to wake up every day and deal with this. So allies have a real imperative to sustain themselves, but also acknowledge that the effort and energy and expenditure of social capital when being an active ally pales in comparison to actually being a part of the community that is marginalized. So, burnout is certainly real. Economic injustice and just life in America and abroad is challenging in and of itself, but we can't let a little burnout, cause us all to bail on diversity, equity, and inclusion, because the communities who've been fighting this fight since the day they were born are experiencing worse burnout than the rest of us. So it's just, it's important to put it in context.
Yeah, and I think what we're saying here, right, is really it's the big picture, right? I mean, we talk about at the top of this hour, I shared a little bit that our intent here is to grow as leaders, all of us. I mean, I learn every time as I'm, conducting some of these webinars myself, from panelists and from our audience, who are being pretty active, by the way, on the chat here. I see some great resources that are being shared, so please check out the chat if you're not already. And thank you for sharing. You're helping. You're being an ally by sharing resources. Thank you so much. But I will say that the big picture, again, if you reflect on the pandemic, right, we all got affected by something that got started likely somewhere far away from us. There's still debate on that, and I don't want to get into that part of it, but it certainly didn't start right where we are for most of us on this webinar or listening to it later. And so we got affected by it hugely. Look at how hugely impacted we got by something that happened a very, very long distance from us, and that we could have had no knowledge of it. This in itself, if it doesn't prove that we prosper and we suffer together, in one way or another, the world, whether we like it or not, whether we would like to have it this way or go back to the 100 years ago, is connected, even if we're not aware of it, in everything we do every day, through technology, through supply chain, through the banking systems, economic connections, and safety and security implications. We're all connected in one way or another. And so even if we are a person that doesn't feel any, hasn't had any personal lived experience or personal connection to race, ethnicity, disabilities, I would include all the other diversity parameters, right? Gender identity, sexual orientation, and so on, and age, certainly ageism as well. We are being affected by it. We may just not be aware of it. And we just have to accept that as I think as a broader concept, or at least reflect on it and see if we want to accept that we are connected. And if we are all connected in this human experience, that it makes sense to do something about having a better environment for everyone. And women being half the population, being that we all have mothers and other females in our lives in other ways, then it makes a lot of sense that we'd be focused on it. So I think we've made a great case for that, but let's talk about more again in what we can all do when it comes to year-round actions, right? We talked about the live webinar here today is being held on March 30th. So we're at the end of pretty much, this Women's History Month, and the International Women's Day is behind us. But talk to, if you would, a little bit about what we can do beyond, the performative or the typical activities that we've seen all this month. And those are good, book talks, panels, events, and so on. What can we all do, especially leaders and allies, to keep the focus on gender equity, and all kinds of equity and inclusion all year round, to help identify, address inequities, especially in the workplace. Let's focus it for a moment, this conversation, for the next, the remainder of this conversation on the workplace. How can we do, what are some specific things you have seen done that kind of go throughout the year?
I think that pay transparency is obviously a huge one. And I know Emily will probably speak to that a lot more than I can. She probably has all the stats behind it. My company has pay transparency, and it's been a game changer, not just for women, but just really to attract and retain talent as well. It just shows that your company is willing to be transparent. And then on top of that, creating a compensation and promotion process within the organization that is open to everyone. Again, that just creates a lot of transparency. So there's no hiding anything. There's no secrets. Everyone is on the same page. And again, it's all about attracting and retaining that talent. But something that I thought of is, of course, an answer is going to be hiring and promoting women. I think more so we should be hiring entry-level women so that it's easier to promote from within. But I wanted to say something for all the women that are on this call now and all the women that are listening in later. Apply, even if you do not meet 100% of the qualifications. I do not have the exact stats around it, but men tend to apply to any job. And I think it might be around if they meet 50 to 60% of the qualifications. Women feel as though they need to meet 90 to 100% of those qualifications to even apply for a job in an organization. So yes, there is a lot of responsibility to the organizations, but I also want to make sure that us women are holding ourselves accountable to also taking that first step and actually applying to the role first. Look, the first, I know, and I'm guilty of it too. I see someone said that.
Yeah, you're having comments, several
Yeah,
things.
I'm totally guilty of it as well. Do it. The worst they're going to say is no, right?
Yeah, no, 100%. You know, I have a quick anecdote to say about that. It makes me chuckle, you know, because I had mentors and sponsors who certainly promoted me as, you know, like for different roles when I certainly didn't think that I was ready for it. And I also had at one point in my executive career, you know, I had a woman who was very, very capable. And I remember distinctly, I had, you know, decided to promote her. And then the next thing I knew, my assistant told me that she was asking for a meeting with me. So I thought she was coming to like thank me. And I said, oh, it's okay. You know, I was busy. And he said, no, she's insisting to talk to you before you actually, you know, announce this promotion. And so she was like about 3 levels, you know, in the organization, down in the organization. So I said, oh, sure, you know, she can come talk to me. So she came and she had come to convince me that she wasn't ready. So I convinced her otherwise, and I asked her to please take it on. She did an amazing job. 2 years later, I was promoting her again. And same thing happened. She scheduled a meeting again, and she came up to tell me that she was just getting comfortable in that role. This is a super smart engineer, right? And that she didn't quite feel ready for the next level. And this time, you know, I cut the conversation short and I said, look, you are now insulting me. And she was like, no, I didn't intend to do that. And I said, well, you are, because you're questioning my judgment. Yes. I believe you're ready. And so I'm really chuckling because that's just happened to me on both sides of it. I'm guilty of it myself too. And I know there was a question here that I want to bring up in the chat. It talks about what are the thoughts on the kind of equity we should be striving for? You know, is it equity in opportunity or equity in outcomes?
I'm happy to speak to that. I also want to share one really practical allyship strategy any of us can employ. So I want to make sure I can give that piece of information. But I think if you're producing equity in opportunity and it's not yielding more equitable outcomes, then maybe you're not actually creating equal opportunity in the ways that you think you are. So I do think that, you know, we can't choose one or the other. It's both, and it depends. So that's not a very helpful answer, but
well, if I may, let me add this also. I mean, there is a distinction between equity and equality.
Sure.
Right. We recognize that certainly in our work, we've often, you know, talked about that. But I will say that there's some cases, you know, the concept really hinges on the idea of what are people's needs, right? And so, you know, it's like giving everybody the same shoe size, right, is the anecdote.
Yeah.
It's giving people, you know, shoe that fits. So certainly there is that aspect, but I 100% agree with you in terms of opportunities where equality should be the outcome. I mean, why shouldn't there be? As you said, when Jack Ma said there was 35% of his executive management were women, it was a time when most of the tech companies like him didn't even have 10% or 15%.
Right.
So it seems good, right? But ultimately, what should the goal be? Well, where you operate, are there half the people are women? Then why shouldn't it be half, right? It should be. I mean, that's so equal outcomes sometimes apply when, you know, depending on the situation. But in some other cases where you're talking about, you want equality in terms of work flexibility. Well, no, maybe women who are going through child raising and childbearing might need more time off, and that may not be equal outcomes, right? So it just really depends, as you said. But I mean, those are a couple of examples.
I'm reminded of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg being asked, you know, at what point will you be happy to see gender equity on the Supreme Court? And she said, when every justice on the Supreme Court is a woman. And people were like flabbergasted. And that concept is so wildly out of our realm of possibility. And yet, for how many years has it been all men? And we're all fine with that. So, equity and equality are very subjective terms. It's not equal, parity in leadership is not always 50-50. Certainly progress should be celebrated, but when you're not seeing equitable outcomes, maybe revisit the process, maybe revisit the changes you've made because they perhaps didn't go far enough. I want to share one really practical amplification strategy, which came out of the Obama White House in the first administration, which was overwhelmingly dominated by men. Women in the Obama White House, and this is a practical allyship action any one of us can take. They came up with a tactic called amplification. So when Tiana says something really profound in a meeting, and then Jack says it again next week, and everyone applauds Jack and forgets that this was Tiana's idea, an ally can easily say, hey, Tiana, wasn't that what you said last week? I loved that idea, Tiana. Literally saying her name, giving credit where credit is due, disrupting interruption, because we know women are twice as likely as men to be interrupted in the workplace, and passing the mic, saying, hey, Sonia, what were you going to try to finish there? Because I know you got cut off. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Those are such immediately accessible tactics for any one of us, regardless of hierarchy and power and privilege, can find our voice and use it in service of others.
That's fantastic. We always talk about micro actions, right? And some of what you mentioned are some of those. And I just can't thank you enough for making it real, making it really specific. Let me, for a moment, before we are within 5 minutes, we always end on time. So I do want to put up the recertification credits at this point. This is just what I'm always reminded by my team that I must share. So can everyone see? I mean, I will leave this up for a moment here so y'all can see the codes. But meanwhile, I want to continue our conversation and ask you in the last few minutes here. First of all, if anyone has any other questions, please put them in the chat. But Tiana and Emily, could you, each of you, kind of bring us home here in the last few minutes? If you want the, there's a lot of solutions, right? I mean, creating safe spaces where you can either, you can actually learn about what women needs are, for example, without them fearing, some kind of a backlash, ERGs. I mean, there's a lot of constructs like that we have in the workplace. What can leaders specifically do if you're in a leadership role and you have an influence over, the processes, the policies, the structures in the organization? What's the one thing? And you already mentioned, the pay equity assessments, of course, Tiana, and you've given great examples of things that we could all do. But any last thoughts that if somebody is going to leave this webinar, or they're listening to it at a later time as a recording, and they want to do something, they're now hopefully everybody is all geared up to go do something, because we know that if we don't, we're part of the problem, right? So what would you recommend?
Really quickly, I would say listen more and actively listen. So actively listening means you're listening to understand, you're not listening to respond.
And I would add, invest in women's professional development. I happen to have a company that does exactly that, but really creating curated programs for women emerging leaders that specifically addresses the unique and gendered challenges that women face.
And Emily, let me challenge you in the last minute that we have here. Wouldn't some people say, well, why should I create that for women only? What about the men? The men are going to be upset because I don't have a program for them.
Well, then we should all be wearing the same size shoes, right? That would be equality. Once again, just to go back to the difference between equity and equality, women face unique challenges. They deserve safe spaces to discuss them and know that they're not alone. Because when we have courageous communities where women can come together, we recognize that, oh, wow, our gender is actually part of what is systemically maybe holding a lot of us back. And when we feel less alone, we can recognize that we're part of a systemic, we're part of a system of oppression that we all need to actively dismantle together.
Yeah, and I certainly 100% agree with you. I would also answer my own question that, the bottom line is, if you had a balance and one side was clearly, out of balance, you would do something about it, right? To try and bring it back into balance. We must do that until there is balance. But meanwhile, I have many, I sit on public company board. I have many colleagues, and now I have some colleagues who say, if I'm a white cisgender male, I can't get on a board because everybody wants, diversity on boards. And of course, there's some legislation and some requirements by NASDAQ and others in that regard. And I always say that, well, we all have a brand. Make yourself unique in some other way. I mean, the reason people want or do a better job of highlighting what your uniqueness is, frankly, all the peers that I have that are cisgender white males, they're awesome people and they deserve to be on boards too. And maybe the answer is expanding the boards and, as age limits come up, making different choices so that is brought into balance. And where there has been legislation, I'm also proud of my state of California, where there's legislation around board gender equity. It does work. It's been seen to work, although it's not always the right solution for everyone to require it. So with that, we're going to have to leave it here. I truly appreciate all of your thoughts and all of the active engagement on the chat. Please connect with all of us. If anybody wants access to Tiona or Emily, we're happy to provide it. I'm at Sonia@OurOffice.io. We can also put all of our, I'm just putting it now in the chat. And so please feel free to put your emails in the chat. But thank you all, really appreciate it. And can't wait until next month for our next webinar. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thanks, y'all.